Hey everyone, it's Tom from Blender Tutor, and in part 2 of this two-part series, we'll be going over how to create this icy material in Cycles, using only 2 tiling textures that you can download for free on textures.com. Link for those are in the description. In part 2, we went over how to animate this text using the free Commotion add-on. If you haven't watched that yet, click on the link now to check that out. You can also get access to the project files for part 1 and part 2 on my Patreon. All patrons get access to the project files for all of my tutorials, as well as exclusive new material packs each month. Alright, let's get started. So the first texture we're going to use is this Snow 0193 on textures.com, so you can download that. There is a free version. I'm using the seamless one. So let's start with our text. We're going to have one material for the text and then a different material for the ground. So let's go into shading view. I'm going to join these areas. You can just right click on the middle line and hit join area. Go into camera view right there. Now I'm going to do that for down here as well, so we have a little bit more workspace. And I'm also going to change our render engine over to Cycles and GPU compute. And I'll just go into render view right now. While it's rendering, if you hit Control B, you can draw a box over your view, so it's only rendering inside of the camera view. And right now the lighting is a bit bland, so let's just add in an HDRI real quick. Cool. Now let's create a new material. I'll just call this ice text. And the first thing we'll do is let's select our principled BSDF. If you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, you could hit Control T and that'll automatically bring in a texture coordinate node, a mapping node, and then the image texture node. So we're going to open up our ice texture that we have. Alright, and once that is plugged in, we can zoom in and kind of fix this. This is looking a bit weird. So we're going to change a couple things. We're going to go from UV mapping to object under texture coordinate, and that fixed the front of it, but you can see the middle part of our C is weird. That's because we have flat mapping enabled. So let's change that to box, and now it's going to project it onto each side separately. And then for blend, let's bring that to 0.2. It just kind of blends the seams together. And now if we want to change the scaling of our texture on the letter, we could bring in a input value node, plug that into the scale, and the lower this number gets, the bigger the texture will appear. Actually 0.5 is looking pretty good for this right now, so we could just leave that, but you could adjust that to your liking. And there's a lot we could do just with this principled BSDF node. So I want the ice to be partially see-through, and you might think you had to add a glass node or some kind of a transparency and everything, but what we could do is actually use the transmission slider here, and the closer to 1 that gets, the more see-through our text gets. We're going to use this texture to kind of turn it into a mask, so only part of the ice is see-through. But first, let's do the roughness. So let's bring in a converter color ramp node. And if you hit Control Shift and then click on a node, it's going to show you the output of that node without any shading on it. That is super useful when we're adjusting things like this. One last thing we're going to change on our texture node right here is change the color space from sRGB to non-color. Since we're not going to be using this directly as a color input into like our base color or anything like that, we're only going to be using this for the roughness, we'll be using it for the transmission value, and we'll also be using it for the bump. So for color ramp, we're going to use a couple of these, but this one will be for roughness. So let's bring up the darkness quite a bit, and then we can slide down our white closer to the middle. We just want to bring up the contrast of this a bit. Maybe a little bit more. And then we can plug that directly into the roughness. And now if we look through that node, and then unplug it from the base color, you're not actually seeing too much right now because it's all white, but if we look at it from an angle, you could see the reflection is different based on the roughness pattern from our texture. This will become a little more apparent once we add in the bump and the transmission. So let's take this color ramp and just duplicate it. Let's bring that up a little bit, duplicate this and bring it down. Put in our texture into this one. Now let's preview this node. And we could bring this down a little bit, slide this over, and we're going to plug this into the transmission. So with this color ramp, you could see that anything that is white is going to be see-through, and anything that's black is going to kind of be a little bit opaque. Fully black will have no transmission whatsoever. And I want this to be an icy material, so I want everything to be a little see-through. So let's change this black up to a dark gray, just so it lets a little bit more light pass through. Might bring that down a little bit. All right. And then we're gonna duplicate this one last time, and we could just reset it. So you could just do this little drop down and reset color ramp, plug that in. And this is going to be used as our bump input. So let's bring in a vector bump node. We'll plug that into the height. And then the normal will go into normal right there. And that's going to be a little strong. So let's bring this down to 0.2. And also this invert right here, check that. It's just going to reverse the height map. So instead of sticking out, it's going to be kind of indenting into the ice. And this will be a lot more useful and apparent once we have the color in the background. And then I did one last thing, so let's bring this all the way over here. This is pretty much done for the ice, but to stylize it a little better and to make it more visible against the background, I kind of added this. It's not natural to how actual objects behave in the real world, but this is just kind of a stylized thing I did. I'm going to add in an emission node, and let's bring in a transparent node, shaders I mean, and then let's bring in a mix shader and plug those in. So it'll be the transparent on top, emission in the bottom, and I'm going to give this emission like a little bit of a blue color. And I'll probably bring that up to like 2 or something. So if we were to view this right now, it looks bad, but you could see it's giving light off, which I don't want. But what if we bring in a Fresnel node, and let's preview that. So Control Shift on that. And we're gonna kind of use this as a mask. So I'm gonna bring this down to 1.2. And I'm also going to bring in a color ramp node. And I'm just going to bring the black up a little bit. So now you can see the white parts are just on these edges up here and then in the middle and right there. So yeah, once we've done that, we're going to have to do one more thing. So let's, if we're looking at this, it's not what we want. This is just a fully emissive letter right now. But if we bring in a input light path node, and we plug in the isCamArray to the FAC value. Now you can see that took away the emission, like it's not giving off light anymore. Whereas right now you can see that this C is lighting the H and the ground. But once we go through the mix shader, basically what this is doing, this isCamArray is masking off, so the camera is seeing the emission, but the rest of the scene is only getting this transparent, which is nothing. So it's not giving off any light anymore. So that's part of the effect. Then we'll mix that with our Fresnel and color ramp right here. So we're gonna need one more mix shader. So let's duplicate that. And this will go into the bottom, and we'll take our original texture or a material and plug that into the top. Then we'll use our mask right here. And now let's plug that in. And you can see I'm getting this nice lighting on the edges of our C. It's just kind of helps it stand out from the background a little bit. And you can adjust that using this IOR value in the Fresnel, and you could also adjust it using our color ramp right here. I'm going to leave it as is though. And that's everything for the letters. So I'm going to go into Eevee real quick. And now let's just select all of our other letters and then select the C last. Go up to Object, Make Links and Materials. It'll copy that over to all of them. And now they all look different enough, but since we have two L's and they're the exact same mapping on them, let's take this second L and let's hit the 6 right here to create a separate copy of this material. And now we're just going to change the mapping a little bit. So we just move that over a little bit and the Y. Now you can see these look like two different letters with different textures on them. Great. So that's working out fine for now, though it barely stands out from the background since that is all white. So let's do that. One other thing though, if you notice in my original animation, all of my letters had snow on them. I actually used a super easy method, which is a add-on called Real Snow. And if you're using Blender, I believe it's 2.83 and above, it comes built into Blender. So if you don't have it, you can just go to Preferences, Edit Preferences, go to Add-ons, and just search for Real Snow. So turn it on. If we go into our layout view, hit N on the keyboard. Once you've enabled it, you should have a little side panel called Real Snow right here. Now with all of our letters selected, you can change the coverage and the height of the snow. For now, I'm going to leave them as the default, and you can just hit Add Snow, and any object that you have selected, it will automatically calculate and add the snow for you. It also creates the material for the snow, so you don't have to do anything. The one thing I did is, in my opinion, the snow is a little too shiny. So I'm going to bring the specular down to like 0.2, and I'll bring the roughness up to 0.35. Unfortunately, every copy of the snow has its own version, so I'm just going to grab all the other ones and then link it to my first one. So make link material. There we go. Now they all share the same roughness and specular values. All right, so we have our letters done. Let's do the ground next. So select the ground, create a new material, and let's call this ice ground. And this one we're going to use the ice material, the ice texture from textures.com that we used in the letters, but we're also going to use a second one, which is just some scratches. So we're going to use this material right here. This once again has a free version. You can just grab the Seamless. I believe all you need is a free account on textures.com, and you'll get access to downloading these free textures. So once you have that downloaded, let's do the same thing we did before and select our principled BSDF, hit Control-T, and we're actually going to do a couple things this time. So let's change our texture coordinate to object again. But one other thing we're going to do is in our 3D scene, let's go ahead and bring in an empty. You can just leave it for now. Click on the ground again, and we're going to change this image texture to a gradient texture. So if you hit Shift S over a node that is selected, you could actually switch it without having to delete it and add a new one. So we could just go to Texture, Gradient. I'm going to change this to Easing, so it's just a little bit smoother. And for our object, for the texture coordinate, let's choose that empty. And what that allows us to do is we could actually now like rotate this, and we can move it along the ground. I could even scale it up, and that's gonna kind of scale the gradient as well. I'm just gonna scale that up a bunch, rotate it so we kind of have this diagonal for the background color, and then we'll go ahead and add in a color ramp. And we're just gonna change both of these colors. So let's have this black. Let's make this like kind of a dark blue color. And then for the white, that's just going to be a much lighter blue color. I'm going to actually probably make this even darker. And then I'm going to adjust our gradient a little more, just scale it up and move it back a little. I just want it to be darker back here and lighter up front. So once we've done that, we can go ahead and click on our principled BSDF again, hit Control T, bring in another set of these. We're going to change this to object again. And then for our image texture, we're going to choose the snow texture that we had before. Should be non-color. And let's go ahead and bring in a input value node again. Plug that into the scale. And let's bring that up a bit just to scale down the look of the texture. I'll do like 1.3 for now. And you could always change that later. And now I'm going to bring in another color ramp. And let's just preview that. So Control Shift click. I'm going to turn that up, bring up that contrast. And you can see I basically used this as a mask to add like a little snow layer on top of the ice, which we'll do in a second. But I'm gonna bring that up a bit to bring in a lot of that black. This looks like a good point for now. And I'm just going to plug that directly into the roughness. Unplug that from the subsurf. Okay, so you can see the roughness is kind of showing up. Let's go into cycles again. And you could also now read the text a lot better against this blue background instead of the bright white background from before. So what we're going to do now before we go any further, let's bring in a vector node real quick. So just bring in a bump. Bring that down to 0.2, and we know we're going to have to invert this, so just go ahead and do that right now. Before we do anything else though, let's duplicate our texture node. And now let's bring in that scratch node that we had. And the scratches look a little too big to me, so I'm going to actually bring this up a bit more. That looks a little better. We want them to be pretty tiny, so like 2.4 for that. And that will affect the scale of this as well, but that is okay. I think that'll still look good. So with that brought in, let's just duplicate this color ramp. Let's reset it and let's plug that into there. All right. So now we're gonna bring in a color mix RGB node. We're gonna change this to add. And what we're gonna do is basically we're gonna plug in the top input our color ramp from the snow texture or the ice texture, and then the bottom will just be the texture from the scratches. And now let's preview that, and I'm going to just turn that up to 1. And it's kind of hard to see, but basically that's just adding the scratches on top of our snow texture. So now I want to plug that into our height value for bump, and we could plug that into the normal input. Let's go to camera view again, and you can see we got some bump going on now. Might be a little too strong. We could turn that down to like 0.17, but that's still looking pretty boring and not very good. So let's add, and let's duplicate this add node right here, bring it up a bit. And in our first input, we'll put our color ramp from our snow texture again. And we'll just do that again here. So we'll take the scratches texture down here, but we're going to bring that up here so it's a little easier to work with. Now let's duplicate that color mix RGB one more time. Switch this to mix now. The input up here will be the blue color ramp. And then the other one will be the mixed textures from the snow and the scratches. Put that right there. Now if you look at that, 100% mix, it's not looking good, but if we bring this down to like 0.3, 0.4, you're gonna get some snow on top of our color, and you're also gonna get those scratches. Now we could plug that into the base color right here, and that's looking a lot better. And it is a little low contrast right now, so what we can do is go to our render tab up here, go down to color management, and let's change the look from none to high contrast. And that gives us a little more contrast there. It's gonna look a little better, but the rest of it we're gonna do in compositing. There's one last thing I do want to address before we get to compositing though. Let's just go out into the 3D view, grab our ground. I'm going to go into edit mode and extrude down a little bit. I just want to give the ground some thickness. It doesn't really matter exactly how much, you just need to have a little bit of thickness. And the last thing I'm going to do is with our ground texture, I'm going to give it a little bit of subsurf scattering. So I'm just going to do 0.15, maybe even just 0.1. And that's basically just going to allow for light to scatter throughout the ice, which would happen in real life. You're also going to be getting that on the snow, but that is done by default. Cool, so the textures are now all set up. One last thing I want to do before we composite to get the look we're going for is go to the render passes tab, the view layer properties tab. Let's turn on vector right here so that when we render this, it'll give us a vector pass to composite with. And I'm also going to let's go to the camera real quick. Go to the camera tab down here. Let's go to viewport display, turn limits on. That's going to give us this little crossbar, and we can use that for our depth of field. So let's also turn depth of field on. I'm going to go into top view right now, and I'm going to move up this distance slider, and you can see this is moving closer to our text. I basically just want to get it in line with the front of our text. It could be a little bit intersecting. Now let's go into rendered view, and you can see in the background now we have a nice soft view right here, but the text should be nice and sharp. If the text is a little blurry, you can turn up the f-stop. So the lower this number is, the blurrier it will be. But if you brought it up to 4 or 5, that might give you a little more sharpness if you need it for the text. It's just going to kind of depend on the angle your camera is at. Once that's all done, let's go to the render tab. I'll leave it at 128 for now, but I am going to turn on denoising. I have an NVIDIA GPU, so I could use this optics version, but the open image denoise or I'm not sure what this NLM is. I actually have never used it, but I would definitely recommend turning on denoising for this, because unless you want to wait a very long time, it's not going to look very good without some denoising. So let's render it real quick and then we'll jump into the compositor. All right, so now that that is done rendering, let's go into the compositing view. I'm gonna give a little space here, and then I'm just gonna bring in a viewer node. So if I hit Control Shift on our render layers, it's gonna bring that in, and it is much bigger than the size of our monitor. So in the side tab, if you go to View, you could hit Fit, and that should shrink it down, but I'm gonna bring it down the zoom even more, just so we could have enough space to see what we're doing. I'll bring that up. So the first thing we're gonna do is let's go ahead and bring in a, go to color, RGB curves. We're just gonna add a little bit more contrast to this. So I'm gonna lower the bottom of this to just really darken it. And I'll play with that a little bit. And then I'll bring the light side up a little bit more. And I might have darkened that a little too much. All right, that's looking pretty good so far, but I actually think I'm gonna have to add a light in the background just to get some backlighting on these letters. And I think in my original scene, I also had a second light up front pointing from the side. So we'll worry about that in a second, but let's go ahead and add in we'll go to Filter, Vector Blur, and plug that in right there. We'll also need our depth pass to go into the Z, and the vector pass to go into the vector. Turn on curved, and pretty shortly you should see some motion here. I like to bring up the samples from 32 to 64 just to smooth it out a little bit. And the last thing I like to do usually is give it a little glare. So let's go to Filter, Glare, plug that into both of our outputs. And I do like the streaks, but it's going to take a while to composite all of this because it has to recomposite everything. So let's just skip the vector blur for now and plug it in directly from the RGB to the glare. And let's turn the mix from 0, which is basically a perfect mix from the glare node and the original. Let's bring that up to 1, so it'll only show the output of the node. And right now you could basically see nothing is being output. That's basically because the light in the scene is not strong enough, so we are going to have to crank up some light. But the other reason is, or the other way we could adjust that, at least for now, is to the threshold is at 1, which is the default. If I bring it down to like 0.5, a lot darker pixels, it's basically the brightness of the pixel. So darker pixels will now show up on the glare node. So we're getting this nice like streak effect. I'm gonna rotate that. So let's do the angle offset. We'll do that by 45. That's what I did for my final render, and that's good for now. I'm gonna change that back to 0. You should see some of that being composited into our image now. So now let's just go back into the scene, and I'm gonna bring in a couple lights. So let's bring in an area light, bring that up a bit, go to side view, I'm gonna rotate that, something like that. And then we can go to pivot point. Let's change that to 3D cursor. And now we can just rotate along the Z, and it should just rotate around our text. So I'm gonna do something like that. Go to the light settings. I like to change that to like a bluish color. And I change the shape from square to disc. And if we go into rendered view, you can see right now, not much is happening. So I'm gonna have to crank this up to like 800. There we go. So we are getting a bit more light now. I might even do 1000, but I'm not liking these shadows it's casting, so I'm gonna actually turn off cast shadows. I really just want to kind of brighten up the scene a little bit. So I'm gonna rotate that a little more. And then the other thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna duplicate that. So Shift D, and then just rotate along the Z to bring that over. And I'll set the pivot point back to bounding box. Bring that down on the Z a little bit, and then rotate it on the X, just so it's still pointing at our letters. And let's see this. So now we're getting some light from the front, but that might be a little too much. So I'll bring this down to like 650, just so we're getting a little bit of light right now. And I know it in this view, it looks a little blown out, but let's render this real quick and then go back to the compositor and see what we get. All right, so now that is done rendering, let's go to compositing, and we're getting a little bit blown out now, so let's just tweak let's tweak this. I'm gonna start over with the curves node and just turn it down overall, and then, so that is looking okay. I do think it's a little blown out, so I would say maybe turn this front light down a bit more, bring it down to like 500, maybe even 350. We just want a little bit of front light so we get some specular and reflections on that. The back one I think is doing okay. We could turn it down to like 850, but I do think this one is still not blowing it out too much. So I'm gonna render this out real quick, and let's take a look at that. All right, so here is our final export. I did tweak the colors a little bit more. I moved the lights around a little bit, and I adjusted the contrast and everything, but overall this is the scene that we just built. So I hope you learned something about creating textures. It's really easy to create these kind of more complex looking materials with just a few simple textures that you could get for free online. So thanks for watching, and if you do create anything from this tutorial, make sure to tag me on Instagram. I'm at ThomasLatvies3D. And otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.